everyone, welcome back to GroundedHaven. Today is May 1st and it's finally the day we've been waiting for. It is time for us to plant out our tomatoes today. It's been about 2 weeks since our estimated last frost date, which is in the middle of April, and in the past week we actually have had a few really cold nights where it's hit almost freezing. But now that those days have gone and the 10-day forecast looks really good, we don't see any temperatures that go below 40 degrees. In fact, most of the nighttime temperatures are actually in the 50s. I think we are in the clear to put out our tomatoes now, which is really good because some of these seedlings have gotten so large. They are really tall in their little seedling cells, and some of them have even started to put on flowers, and we definitely don't want them to start developing fruit while they're still in these trays, so it'll be really great to get them out in the soil now. We have a few places in our garden where we're going to be planting our tomatoes today because we do have a bunch of different types of tomatoes that will require different space and support. I started 12 varieties of tomatoes this year, and the total number of plants that I have is between 25 and 30, so I have 2 to 3 of each variety. And I did go over all of these varieties when I started these seeds, so I will link that video down below if you want to hear a little bit more in depth about the different kinds of tomatoes we have. So the first spot we're starting with is one of the front beds in our raised bed garden. This bed is 3 feet by 8 feet, and I'm going to be planting 8 determinate tomatoes here. I have 2 Celebrity, 2 Ace 55, 2 BHN 1021, and 2 Plum Regal. To add a little bit of support as these tomatoes grow, we're just putting up a makeshift trellis. We're just putting in some T-posts, one on each side of the bed, and we will run a piece of welded wire to go through the middle of the bed. We'll have 4 of our plants on each side of this trellis, and as they grow, we can tie them to the welded wire so that they have more support. With these determinate tomatoes, they should be growing very bush-like as opposed to a very tall indeterminate tomato. So this welded wire is not very tall. I think it's between 4 to 5 feet tall, and I think that height is going to be perfect for these tomatoes, but they will get a lot bushier than other tomatoes, and I'm not going to prune them a lot because for these determinate tomatoes, if you prune a lot of those branches off, you might decrease your yields. So these are supposed to be very high production tomatoes, and I want to give them a lot of space to grow, which is why I am only doing 4 tomatoes on each side, which gives them about 2 feet of space to spread out. This is definitely more space than I've given my tomatoes in the past, so I hope that this extra space does really well and helps with a little bit of disease prevention as well, so that there's more space for the air to circulate. We're attaching our welded wire to the T-post with some zip ties, and I think this is going to be pretty nice and sturdy for the season, but it's also something that we can choose to move around for next season if we want to. I really like to move things around from year to year, so this year I might grow tomatoes here, but maybe next year it'll be peppers or eggplant. This is kind of like a small scale way of doing crop rotation so that if there are any diseases or pests that overwinter in the soil, you're not growing the same thing in the same place year after year. So this was just a trellis that was really quick and easy for us to put together, but it's not a permanent one by any means, which is really a bonus for us so that we can switch things up. While Aaron finishes just getting that trellis set up, I'm starting to place the tomatoes in their spots just so that I can kind of get the spacing down before we dig any holes. With the 4 tomatoes on each side, I am also trying to kind of stagger them so that on one side I can line up a tomato plant kind of in between where the 2 plants are on the other side. For some of my seedlings, as they had been growing, I had potted them up into larger 4-inch pots, but I really just didn't have enough space to pot up all of my seedlings, so some of them did stay in smaller cells. So you can see here's one of them. It is definitely getting to the point where it is pretty root bound, so they definitely needed to go into the ground sooner rather than later, and you can see how tall that plant has gotten. It's not leggy, it's just really tall, and because I was kind of keeping them in smaller cells, I did make sure to fertilize them at least once a week with fish fertilizer, which I think really helped. It gave them enough nutrients to continue growing even in these smaller cells. So now we're going to start planting. By the way, I have already amended this bed with an entire bag of composted manure, so it's ready to go in terms of that, and we are also going to be adding a handful of organic granular fertilizer at the bottom of each of these holes as well. This will be more of like a slow release fertilizer so that it feeds the plants throughout the season. So what I'm doing now is trying to dig a nice deep hole For tomatoes, I really want to dig a hole as deep as I can get it, and you can really bury your plants up the stem a good few inches or even more if you're able to dig down far enough. For my fertilizer, I'm going to be using this Espoma Organic Garden Tone, and I'm just doing a small handful in there, so maybe like a couple of tablespoons. And I just sprinkle it around and it's gonna get mixed in as we fill the hole back in. So here's the root ball of one of the plants that was potted up in one of the 4-inch pots. It looks really nice and healthy. I feel like once you pot up tomatoes, they will just immediately like take up any root space that you give them. And you can tell that the ones that were potted up into these larger pots grow into overall larger plants faster as well, at least in the seedling stage. The other ones I think will catch up really quickly, but you can definitely tell how this one is a little bit bushier rather than tall because it just had a little bit more space to spread out while it was growing. So I'm just patting that soil really nicely, making sure that there are no air pockets in there, and we are going to go in with some plants in between each of the tomatoes later on, and then we're going to mulch at the end of planting, but first we're just going to get all of these tomato plants in. I'm also going to snip off the bottommost set of leaves because any leaves that are touching the soil can pick up diseases from any water that splashes up. I'm just going to do this on the plants that have a lot of leaves on them right now, so if there are only a few sets, I'm not going to cut anything off, but I will go in later on throughout the season and prune off a lot of those lower branches. That's one thing that you can do that really can help you prevent any diseases from taking on too quickly on your tomato plants. So we're just going to continue with the rest of the plants, trying to dig a nice deep hole, adding a little handful of the garden tone, and then burying our plant starts a few inches deeper than the original soil line. And of course, you can't forget your plant tag. I think this year I have done a pretty good job at labeling all of my plants, so I'm really proud of that, and I have a plant tag for each of my plants, so hopefully throughout the season they won't get lost and I'll really be able to tell the difference, because since I'm growing so many different varieties this year and I'm doing a little bit of exploring and trying to figure out what works for us, it's pretty necessary to know what variety each plant is so that in the future I know what does the best for us and what I want to grow again and maybe what's not worth growing. I started these tomato seeds on March 11th, so it hasn't even been 2 months yet, and they are definitely really big and healthy looking. I can't believe how big they are this year, even though I started them a full month after the date that I started them the year before. And I think next year I might even wait another week or two, just because these plants got so big before I was ready to put them out, and they could definitely have gone into the ground when they were a little bit smaller. It might make the adjustment period after they go into the ground a little bit easier. So I had started mulching the tomatoes that I had planted already, but then I realized that I actually wanted to interplant some smaller things in between these tomatoes. So I'm just going to move some of that mulch aside, and for my interplanting crops, I chose to do marigolds and basil. These are two things that we very often grow around the vegetable garden and specifically tomatoes. I feel like basil especially, just because tomatoes and basil go so well together. Some people say that planting basil near your tomatoes can improve the flavor of your tomatoes, but really I just plant them next to each other because in my head it makes sense because you eat them together, and I feel like the sizing of the basil usually works out really well with the tomatoes, because the tomatoes can grow really tall but the basil will just stay like a short bush underneath, and that way as you prune the lower leaves off of your tomato plants throughout the season, the basil has more space to take up that level of the canopy, and it also helps to act almost like a mulch to shade out the soil level so that your soil doesn't get too dried out from the sun. So in between these tomato plants, I'm doing some sweet Italian Genovese basil. And then in some other spots, especially around the corners of the beds where we have staggered our plants, so there's like a bigger empty space, we're going to be planting some marigolds. I have these lemon drop marigolds, which I think are going to get really nice and big. Last year our marigolds got huge when we planted them with our tomatoes, and they add such a beautiful color in the garden, which is always nice. So once we have all of these plants planted into the ground, now I can go in with that mulch and really go around the plants. Mulch is a really important thing if you want to keep your plants cool and moist, especially if you live in a really hot area. This will keep them from getting stressed out in the heat of the summer, and they will just grow a lot better. This winter we had some trees get damaged in a snowstorm, so we had to have some of our trees removed, but the bonus of that is that we asked for the trees to be chipped and left on our property, and now we have a nice supply of mulch for throughout the year, which is really great because we can really go through a lot of mulch around here. And that mulch will act as a really nice protective barrier throughout the season, but as the years go on, that mulch will also break down and feed all of that life in your soil, and you will end up with more fertile soil throughout the years. After transplanting, I'm going to water everything in really nicely. This will help to settle in the soil and get those plants settled into their new homes. We also have a lot of rain forecasted for the upcoming week, which is really great because that will really help the plants root in. And rain also means that you won't have like super hot sunny days either, which is great for right after transplanting, because if it is really hot and sunny out, that can stress out the plants a little bit. So having nice cloudy days or rainy days afterwards is always a nice bonus or something to look out for if you're trying to time your transplanting. But if you don't have any rain in the next few days, just make sure that you are continuing to water your plants for that first week or so. You don't want them to dry out during this part of the process, because the more moist you can keep the soil, the better your plants will adjust to being transplanted and start growing new roots. So the next thing we're going to plant up is a few tiers of our GreenStalk, because I have a few dwarf tomatoes that I'm going to try growing in here since they don't get very large. I think they'll be perfect for this. I have these supports that I can put on a few levels of the GreenStalk, and here I am just trying to figure out how to do it, and I realized that I needed to take some of the tiers off in order to put those supports in. So we're just taking off the top 4 layers, and we're going to be planting up the bottom 2 layers because the other 4 layers already are all filled with plants. So you can see how I have these rods that go in between the levels, and this ring of supports is actually a support for the level beneath it. So as the plants on the lower level grow up, they will grow up through the supports and be able to grow against it. So in addition to tomatoes, I'm actually going to be planting some smaller pepper plants as well. So I'm going to do that first because those are going to go on the bottom layer. We have 3 shishito peppers and 3 jalapeno peppers. The shishito peppers are probably one of my favorites from last year. They were crazy productive and so delicious. And the plants don't get very large, so I think that they'll be perfect to grow in this GreenStalk. So for each of my little pockets, I'm adding another handful of garden tone and also a handful of some compost, and that should help them grow. But because this is a container which can leach out nutrients a lot faster than in the ground or in a raised bed, I'm also going to be making sure to put liquid fertilizer at the top of my GreenStalk, where there's a reservoir that drips down to each level, so every tier will get some of that liquid fertilizer, and I'll do this every couple of weeks or so throughout the summer so that my plants are continually fed. My pepper seedlings are looking really nice. I started these a week before the tomato seedlings, so these were started on March 3rd, and they do a lot better in smaller pots for a prolonged period of time, so I never had to pot these up, and I think that they were fine for the entire time as seedlings in their 2-inch pots. So we're just gonna do one of these peppers for each of these pockets on this bottom tier. So now moving on to the next level, we are going to be doing some of our dwarf tomatoes here, and I also have a couple of miniature cucumbers that I'm going to try in here as well. So since we have the layers above removed, it's a little bit easier to get in here, adding our compost and fertilizer. So we're just amending the entire level before we go in with our seedlings. I have 4 dwarf tomato plants. 2 of them are Tiny Tim and 2 of them are Cherry Falls. So you can see the shorter ones in the front of this little packet here are the Tiny Tim, and then the Cherry Falls are quite a bit taller. They're taller than I thought that they would be, but they're already putting off a lot of blossoms, so maybe this is like the max height that it will get. It did say that it was good for containers, so I'm going to go ahead and try it, even though it is bigger than I thought. But the Tiny Tim does look like a very small dwarf tomato, so it'll be interesting to kind of see the differences between these two as they grow. And they both are supposed to produce smaller cherry type tomatoes. In the other 2 pockets, I'm going to be planting up some mini white cucumbers, which I started just a few weeks ago, and they're pretty small now. They just are starting to get their first set of true leaves. When I've grown these in the past, the plants stay pretty short. The vines only get to about 3 feet long, so I think they'll be fine here. They might trail out a little bit, but I think with the help of the supports that I'm going to have, they're going to do fine. And these cucumbers stay really small. They're only like a few inches long. They're great for pickles, and they're also really nice and sweet and great for fresh eating. So I've got 2 plants of each variety that we're planting here, and I've kind of split them up so that the 2 plants of each variety are on opposite sides of the GreenStalk, just because I think that'll look really nice and make our GreenStalk really nice and like symmetrical. And as we plant these, we're also sort of trying to angle them outwards a little bit, because we are going to have to put the other tiers on top of this, and just to try and prevent damaging these plants as we place the upper levels. If we kind of angle the plants outward a little bit, they won't be directly where we need to place the next tier. So now that we're done planting, we're going to put the rest of the tiers back on. We can't forget to put in that watering disc, and then we're just going to pop on the next tier, and then we're going to have to add one more support ring around that one as well. So now our GreenStalk is officially completely filled in. We have our freshly planted pepper and tomato plants, and you can see how this one tomato plant has so many flowers on it, so hopefully we'll get some early tomatoes from these dwarf plants, because a lot of these dwarf varieties are a lot quicker to fruit, closer to like 55 days to maturity versus 85 to 95 days for larger tomatoes. And in the upper layers where we planted beans a few weeks ago, those are all starting to pop up now, so those will fill in really quickly. And then in the top 2 tiers, we have our strawberry plants, which are starting to flower, so hopefully we'll have some strawberries soon as well. Now moving on to the last area that we're going to be planting some tomatoes today. We're in our back in-ground garden, and we have this little kind of like trellis setup. So we have some T-posts, and at the top of each of these we have some PVC tees with some PVC pipe run through them. And the plan here is that we don't have any kind of wire or cattle panel or anything like that. We're just going to plant our tomatoes, and each tomato plant is going to be tied off at the base, and then that string is going to run up to the PVC up top. And as the tomato plant grows, we're going to wrap that string around and around the stem. This is a new trellising method for us, and I don't know what it's called, but I have seen other people do it with success, so we're going to try it out this year. I think it will work really well for the tomato varieties that I have that are indeterminate and get very tall. So all of the varieties that I picked for this back area can get like 6 to 7 feet tall. And usually by the end of the season, tomatoes that get this large are very hard for me to manage. They just tend to flop over no matter how I try to trellis them. So I am hopeful that this new method will work, and this does depend very heavily on proper pruning of the plants. As they grow, I'm going to have to prune them down to a single stem. A lot of tomato plants like to branch out, and I'm just going to have to make sure I trim off any of those side shoots and any of those suckers as well. And by keeping to that just one single stem, it will be able to be supported by that string. And this should also help with a lot of diseases because there will be a lot less foliage and there will be a lot more air circulating throughout these plants. So it's kind of difficult to explain, but hopefully as the season goes on, I will be able to demonstrate this a little bit better. Definitely by the next garden tour, I will have had the string set up, so you will see kind of like the beginning of this process, and we'll just see how well I do with the pruning this year. So for the planting, it's pretty much the same method as we did in our raised bed. We're just trying to dig as deep of a hole as possible to plant our tomato seedlings, and we're adding a handful of garden tone. And I believe I had already amended this bed with either some chicken bedding or maybe some homemade compost in the fall. So I think overall the bed should be pretty good, but we are also adding an extra handful of manure down at the bottom of each of our holes as well, just so that we can make sure that the nutrients are definitely right there where the plants need them. And I didn't mention this when we were planting the other tomato plants, but the reason that we plant them so deeply is that tomatoes can develop roots all along that stem. So anywhere where that stem is buried, it's going to form new roots, which is going to produce a much more healthy plant that's going to become very well established, so that eventually you can get more fruit off of the plant. As for the varieties that I'm planting in this back area, here I have a lot of my heirloom tomatoes. So a few of the ones that I have back here are Pink Bumblebee, I have Paul Robeson, and Purple Russian. These are a lot of the tomatoes that we like to eat fresh, but I do like to have a mix of heirloom tomatoes that you're growing more for their flavor rather than the production or the disease resistance, and also a combination of hybrid and higher production tomatoes and paste tomatoes, because those production ones and paste tomatoes I use a lot for preserving, canning, and making sauce. Whereas a lot of these ones back here, they have more distinctive heirloom flavors. So a lot of these will be snacking on and eating fresh. I've really tried hard to go into the garden this spring, having everything really nicely set up, all of our infrastructure, things like our trellising and the cattle panels, and also having some wire hoops with fabric to cover any plants that need to be protected by pests. And I've also expanded our drip irrigation to this back garden area because in the past I had been really bad about watering it and a lot of things in this back area didn't do very well. And I am gonna kind of go over very quickly our irrigation in another video. It's very DIY, not very official, but I will kind of just show you how I did it just in case you are looking to do the same thing. And these are just improvements and things that we've added on after a few years. This is our third year going into this garden, so we're learning a little bit every year and trying to improve. Things like this take time either to build up the infrastructure or just to learn the skills or learn the pests and diseases that are in your area. So hopefully every year we're just growing and learning a little bit at a time. But there's really something cool about that day when you're putting out so many of these plants that you started from seed and it's the beginning of the season in the spring, and I'm just picturing in my head all of the tomatoes and peppers and all of the good veggies that we're gonna get off of these plants. There's just so much hope ahead for what the garden can produce, and it's a really exciting time, and I'm really hopeful that this is going to be our best gardening year yet. After we planted up this row of tomatoes, we also decided to go ahead and plant up the next row, which is going to be for some cucumbers and also some of our Asian melons and gourds. We have this row that's set up with T-posts and a cattle panel, so this is about 5 feet tall. So I had just a couple of leftover tomatoes that I added to the end of here, but most of this is going to be for cucumbers, and this panel will be perfect for them to climb up as they grow. These cucumbers were started on April 12th, so it's been just a few weeks. Most of them just have their seedling leaves and then are starting to get their first set of leaves, but I did want to get them out sooner rather than later because cucumbers and melons can be a little bit sensitive to transplanting, and you can see when we pop them out of the pots there are plenty of roots down there, and I definitely don't want them to get root bound in these pots, so I figured I would just put them out while they're still in this really young seedling stage. I think they will transplant a lot better while they're really nice and young. So I think we ended up with 3 or 4 different varieties of cucumbers in this area, and again, I started those in a video, so if you want to go and watch all of the different varieties, you can check that out. The cucumbers really are going to be just like half or 2/3 of the row, and then the last little bit I'm going to put some of my Asian gourds there. So I have bitter melon, silk squash, and also a winter melon. Those take up just a little bit more space, so I'm spacing those a little farther apart. But for the cucumbers, I'm just staggering them on each side, and then in between each of them we have maybe like 2 or 2.5 feet in between them. They really might not need as much space as we're giving them because they will have a lot of vertical space to go upwards on this trellis, but we can also pop in things in between if we feel like we have extra space later on. So the very last project we're going to tackle for the day, I thought we'd end on something fun and pretty. We went to a local nursery that morning and had picked up some flowers for these hanging planters that we're going to have on the sides of some of our trellises. And I think these are just going to bring a nice bit of color into the garden. So I have my potting soil already filled in, and I'm adding a handful of flower tone so that we'll get plenty of nice continual blooms throughout the season. And then we're going to add these flowers in. I'm not sure exactly what they are. They kind of look like petunias. And I think that one plant for each of these baskets should fill in really nicely and overflow off of the edges. I'm using these cocoa liners, and I have kind of had trouble in the past keeping these moist enough. I just feel like they drain out and dry really quickly. So we'll see how they do this year. I'm going to try and keep them on a daily watering schedule, which again, I am not the best at watering in the garden. And I'm also adding mulch to each of these baskets. Hopefully that will help to keep the moisture levels up a little bit. But hopefully we can keep them alive because they do look really pretty. Erin picked out this color and I just love that like bright orange red. I think it's going to look so nice in the garden, especially because right now we don't have a ton of color going on. So it's nice to just get that instant little pop. So that was everything that we planted for the day. I feel really good about it. I feel like we got a lot in the garden and we still have a ton more to go. We have all of our peppers and eggplants to put out, as well as our zucchini. And I don't know that I'll show all of it because honestly, this time of the season is just so busy. We just have to squeeze in the work whenever we can. But I'll try and show you as much of it as possible. And of course, you'll see it all by the next garden tour. Thank you guys so much for watching this video, and we'll see you again in the next video.